The most sophisticated theft in modern art history didn't happen in a museum. No alarms, no broken glass, no masked figures in a dark corridor. It happened inside boardrooms, tax-free warehouses, and the drawing rooms of billionaires, carried out by men who wore linen blazers and spoke quietly about provenance and legacy. And by the time anyone noticed, 2 Picassos had vanished from a dead woman's private collection, passed through the hands of a Russian oligarch, and the man accused of taking them was standing in a Geneva free port, arguing very calmly that he'd paid for everything legally. This channel exists to show you how power actually moves. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what's coming. Let's start where most people don't. Not with the theft, but with the relationship. In the early 2000s, Dmitry Rybolovlev was one of the richest men in Russia. A fertilizer billionaire worth billions, he had made his fortune in potash, not exactly a glamorous commodity. And he was looking for something more refined, something that announced to the world that he had arrived somewhere new. He was, in his own mind, superior to the room. He would say as much later in court, or rather his own former business partner would say it for him. Rybolovlev believed he was smarter than everyone around him. In the art world, that kind of confidence is a weapon handed freely to those who intend to use it. The person who introduced Rybolovlev to the art world was Tanya Rapo, the Bulgarian-born, Russian-speaking wife of his Swiss dentist, a socialite who moved easily through Geneva's moneyed circles. Rapo introduced him to a Swiss art handler named Yves Bouvier. Not a flashy figure, not a man you'd look twice at in a hallway. When author Ben Lewis met Bouvier in 2018, he found him in a scruffy fleece and bleached jeans, looking nothing like a blue-chip art dealer. That, as it turns out, was part of the design. Bouvier ran thousands of square feet of storage lockers at the Geneva Freeport, a facility that allowed collectors to store works of art in a kind of legal limbo, shielding ownership from taxes and scrutiny. He had access. He had networks. He had the quiet, unassuming manner of a man people confided in. Rybolovlev asked Bouvier to help him build a world-class collection. Bouvier agreed, on the basis that he would source works and charge Rybolovlev a 2% commission. He also advised the Russian to keep his collecting activities secret, arguing that prices rise when sellers know how wealthy the buyer is. Rybolovlev agreed. He trusted Bouvier. He later told a court he had trusted him like family. He even invited him to small birthday parties. Between 2003 and 2014, Bouvier acquired 38 artworks for Rybolovlev: Picasso, Van Gogh, Modigliani, Klimt, Matisse, Rodin, and Leonardo da Vinci. The collection was extraordinary by any standard. What Rybolovlev didn't know was that the man presenting himself as his trusted agent was simultaneously acting as the seller. Bouvier would establish the seller's asking price, then quote Rybolovlev a ballpark figure, tens of millions of dollars higher. The difference went straight to Bouvier. Every single time, for 11 years. Rybolovlev spent approximately $2 billion over 12 years assembling this collection. Bouvier, according to Rybolovlev's legal team, pocketed more than $1 billion of it. The crack appeared on New Year's Eve, 2014. Rybolovlev found himself in conversation with Sandy Heller, Stephen Cohen's art advisor, who mentioned in passing that Cohen had recently sold a Modigliani from his personal collection to an anonymous buyer for $93.5 million. Rybolovlev went quiet. He had purchased that exact Modigliani through Bouvier for $118 million. The markup was more than $24 million, paid entirely to Bouvier on a single transaction. He went back through the records. All 38 transactions. The numbers didn't hold. Not even close. Among the disputed works was Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, a painting Rybolovlev purchased through Bouvier for $127.5 million, which Bouvier had acquired for $75 million. The margin on that single transaction alone was over $50 million. That painting would later sell at Christie's for $450 million, becoming the most expensive work ever sold at auction. Rybolovlev had been systematically overcharged, on masterpiece after masterpiece, by the man he had trusted to protect him from being overcharged. On January 12, 2015, he filed a criminal complaint in Monaco. On February 25, 2015, Bouvier was indicted in Monaco on charges of fraud and complicity in money laundering. The arrest was surgical in its timing. It took place shortly after Bouvier arrived in the Principality, where he had been scheduled to meet Rybolovlev. He walked into what he believed was a business meeting. He walked out in handcuffs. Bouvier was released on a €10 million bail. He denied everything. His position then and for the next 9 years was that he had never presented himself as Rybolovlev's agent. He was the seller, Sellers set their own prices. That's how markets work. The markup, he said, was not fraud. It was commerce. The Russian knew the deal. Rybolovlev's lawyers said that was precisely the lie. What happened next was not a single investigation. It was a cascade. Legal complaints were filed in Monaco, Switzerland, France, Singapore, Hong Kong, and New York. The affair played out in courts across 6 jurisdictions simultaneously. The art world, which had for decades operated in deliberate opacity, was suddenly being examined under conditions it had never been designed to withstand. But then, underneath all of that, something else surfaced, something that had nothing to do with markups or commissions, or the fine print of art market agreements. In March 2015, a woman named Catherine Hutin-Blay filed a criminal complaint in Paris. She was the stepdaughter of Pablo Picasso, the daughter of his second wife, Jacqueline Roque, and she was missing paintings. Hutin had discovered that around 70 drawings and paintings had vanished from a storage unit she leased in a Paris suburb. She had put them into storage in 2018 through art dealer Olivier Thomas, who had been appointed by her to remove part of Jacqueline Picasso's collection from an estate on the French Riviera. The storage facility where those works ended up belonged to Bouvier's company, Art Transit International. The 2 gouache paintings at the center of the case were portraits of her mother, Jacqueline Roque, woman combing her hair, dated February 5, 1957, and Espagnole à l'Eventail, dated December 7, 1957. Intimate paintings, private works, made by Picasso for the woman he loved, and inherited by the woman who had lived in that shadow her entire life. They were gone. They resurfaced because of an art conservator named Flavio Capitulano, who told police he had been commissioned to clean the surfaces of the works. At what he described as the express request of Yves Bouvier, both paintings had been sold to Dmitry Rybolovlev in 2013. He paid, through his family trust, what amounted to 27 million euros for the pair. Rybolovlev returned the works to French authorities immediately. They were handed over to the Brigade de Répression du Banditisme, a specialized unit of the French Ministry of the Interior. Hutin-Blay's position was unambiguous. She had never sold these paintings. She had never authorized their sale. The works had been entrusted to Olivier Thomas for transport and storage, and they had disappeared into the machinery of the Freeport system without her knowledge or consent. Bouvier maintained that he had legally paid $8 million for the artworks through the Nobilo Trust, an offshore entity based in Liechtenstein. Investigators could find no evidence of this transaction. Bouvier also claimed he had paid 9 million euros to Hutin for the works in 2010, but the investigation concluded those payments corresponded to 13 other paintings sold by Hutin through Thomas at an earlier date, none of which appeared on the list of the missing items. In September 2015, Bouvier was indicted by French authorities on charges of concealed theft of the 2 Picassos. Olivier Thomas was detained by French authorities in May 2015, interrogated, and insisted repeatedly that the works meant nothing to him, that he had never seen them before. The justice system maintained that Thomas had seen the works on multiple occasions, and that his feigned confusion was the crux of the problem. Both men were eventually charged. Bouvier and Thomas faced charges of possession of stolen goods. Thomas was additionally charged with fraud. Meanwhile, the Monaco case was collapsing in a direction no one had anticipated. Charges of fraud and money laundering against Bouvier and Monaco unraveled in 2019, after leaked offshore databases revealed that Rybolovlev had allegedly been bribing Monegasque government officials, including the justice minister, in exchange for pursuing criminal charges against Bouvier. The principality's own judicial process had apparently been compromised from inside. An appellate judge in Monaco found that all investigations had been conducted in a biased and unfair way, and that Bouvier had not been in a position to redress the serious anomalies that had permanently compromised the balance of his rights. Rybolovlev, the man who had entered these proceedings as the victim, was now himself under investigation. Monaco prosecutors indicted him for influence peddling and corruption. The scandal acquired its own name, Monaco Gate. The entire structure of the case was beginning to look less like a clear fraud and more like a war between 2 powerful men, each of whom had decided that the law was a tool rather than a constraint. Sotheby's was pulled in next. Rybolovlev accused Sotheby's of having knowingly assisted in the fraud. In June 2019, a U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York ordered that previously sealed email exchanges between Bouvier and Sotheby's vice chairman of worldwide private sales, Samuel Valette, be submitted to the court. According to those files, Bouvier had requested that Valette send evaluations approved by Sotheby's to be passed to Rybolovlev, and that Bouvier subsequently purchased paintings through Sotheby's for amounts lower than those indicated in the valuations, before reselling them to Rybolovlev at prices higher than those evaluations suggested. Sotheby's denied all wrongdoing. The jury sided with them. In January 2024, Rybolovlev lost his fraud lawsuit against Sotheby's, with the U.S. jury finding in the auction house's favor. His lawyer noted that the secrecy endemic to the art market had made it structurally difficult to prove a complex aiding and abetting case. That sentence deserves to sit for a moment. The secrecy of the market, the very thing that made the fraud possible, was also the thing that made the fraud impossible to prosecute. In December 2023, Yves Bouvier and Dmitry Rybolovlev settled. 9 years of litigation across 6 countries, Monaco, Switzerland, France, Singapore, Hong Kong, and New York, concluded with a confidential agreement, the terms of which neither man would disclose. No admission of wrongdoing, no public accounting, no number attached to what changed hands. The statement from Rybolovlev's Geneva attorney, Sandrine Giroux, read simply that the parties had resolved all disputes in all jurisdictions and would refrain from commenting on their past. Bouvier declared at the end of a 9-year nightmare and said that courts around the world had unanimously concluded he was innocent. That was not entirely accurate, and he knew it. Because the Picasso case, the one that had nothing to do with markups or commissions, was still open. That one belonged to a dead woman's daughter, and no settlement between 2 billionaires could touch it. The criminal investigation into the missing Picassos had been launched in 2015, when Hutin discovered that around 70 drawings and paintings had vanished from the storage unit managed by Olivier Thomas through Bouvier's company. That investigation did not close when Bouvier and Rybolovlev shook hands. It continued, quietly, methodically, in Paris. In January 2026, an investigating judge ruled that Yves Bouvier should stand trial before a criminal court in Paris on charges including handling stolen goods and money laundering. The decision followed the assessment that no verifiable documentation had been provided to support the lawful acquisition of the artworks in question. 11 years after Catherine Hutin-Blay first reported her mother's portraits missing. 11 years after 2 Picassos depicting Jacqueline Roque, the woman who had been Picasso's companion for the last 20 years of his life, who had shielded him from the world and buried him, and then, 7 years later, put a gun to her own head in grief. 11 years after those 2 portraits of her resurfaced in a Russian billionaire's private collection, without any paperwork that could explain how they got there. Bouvier's lawyer, Philippe Vallant, announced he would appeal the ruling, denouncing what he called a judgment that denied the hidden maneuvering between the parties and the disloyalty of the magistrates. The language was sharp. The legal machinery, however, kept moving. Both Bouvier and Thomas face charges of possession of stolen goods. Thomas faces the additional charge of fraud. A trial date has not yet been confirmed as of this recording. Neither man has been convicted of anything, but here is what is not in dispute. 2 paintings made by Pablo Picasso, depicting the face of his wife, were placed into the care of a storage and transport network, controlled by men who knew their value better than almost anyone alive. Those paintings were cleaned. Physically cleaned, their surfaces prepared, by a conservator who said he was acting on Bouvier's instructions. They were then sold without any documentation that French investigators could verify to a billionaire in Monaco for 27 million euros. The billionaire had no idea they were allegedly stolen. He returned them the moment French authorities came calling. The paintings were recovered. Rybolovlev handed them over to French authorities in 2015, but of the approximately 70 works Hutin-Blay reported missing, the drawings, the sketches, the pieces torn from Picasso's own sketchbooks and carried out of storage in a Paris suburb, most have never been publicly accounted for. The inventory exists. The works largely do not. The art world absorbed all of this and continued. EU parliamentarians called for Freeports to be urgently phased out following a damning report informed in part by details of the Rybolovlev-Bouvier dispute, stating that the facilities were being used as vast conduits for international money laundering. Nothing was phased out. The long-running dispute had shown a rare spotlight on the secretive international art market, exposing the vast sums that change hands for the shakiest of valuations, often in an opaque manner, with middlemen frequently able to pocket tens of millions on each transaction. The spotlight passed, the opacity returned. Bouvier once said, in his own words, that what he did was not moral, but it was legal. He said that openly, to a journalist, without hesitation, as if the distinction were not just sufficient but elegant. That sentence is worth holding on to, because it is the operating philosophy of an entire industry. Not just one man in a fleece jacket standing in a Geneva warehouse, surrounded by other people's masterpieces. The system that made Yves Bouvier possible did not produce him by accident. Freeports were not designed to store art. They were designed to make ownership untraceable, value unverifiable, and movement invisible. The art was incidental. What was being stored was deniability, and when Picasso's stepdaughter went looking for her mother's face, painted in 1957 by the most famous artist of the 20th century, 2 works of private grief now worth tens of millions, the trail led straight into that system, into the same warehouses, the same offshore trusts, the same verbal agreements with no paper trail, the same men who had spent decades perfecting the art of standing at the center of a transaction while appearing not to be there at all. A trial is coming. Bouvier's lawyers will argue bias. Thomas's lawyers will argue confusion. The French court will weigh documentation that allegedly doesn't exist against the testimony of a conservator who says he cleaned the paintings on Bouvier's orders, and a stepdaughter who says she never sold them to anyone. What the court will not be able to weigh, what no court ever can, is how many other works passed through those same hands, through those same free ports, through those same offshore entities in Liechtenstein and Singapore and Luxembourg, and never surfaced at all, never appeared in a criminal complaint, never prompted a billionaire to pose in front of them for a press photograph in Paris, never gave a grieving daughter anything to point at and say, "That is mine." Those works are somewhere, in temperature-controlled rooms behind security systems that cost more than most people earn in a decade, waiting, as they have always waited, for the market to decide what they are worth and to whom they now belong. Yves Bouvier is awaiting trial in Paris. Olivier Thomas is awaiting trial in Paris. Dmitry Rybolovlev, cleared in Monaco in February 2025, continues to own AS Monaco Football Club. His art collection, assembled at a cost of $2 billion, has been partially sold off over the years, including the Salvator Mundi, which he acquired for $127.5 million, and which sold at Christie's in November 2017 for $450 million. The buyer, acting through an intermediary, was later identified as Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. That painting has not been seen in public since. Some things vanish cleanly,